Imagine stepping onto the surface of a stormy sea only to feel yourself sinking when fear overtakes your faith. As recorded in Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33, this story shows us what happens when faith falters and grace rescues. What did Peter see in Jesus' eyes as he cried out for help, surrounded by swirling wind and waves? This is more than a story of Jesus walking on water. It's about the moments when doubt threatens to pull us under, and the hope that comes when we reach for grace. Before the storm appeared, the night began with a quiet sense of peace. After the crowds dispersed, the disciples followed Jesus' clear instruction: get into the boat and cross to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. For fishermen like Peter, the Sea of Galilee was familiar territory, safe, calm, and under their control. They'd spent countless nights on these waters. Tonight, though, there were no nets to cast or fish to haul. It was simply about following Jesus' direction, carrying with them the memory of the day's miracle. Earlier, they had watched Jesus feed thousands with just a few loaves and fish. The crowd was hungry, and Jesus provided not just enough, but more than enough, 12 baskets of leftovers. The disciples saw firsthand how Jesus cared for people's needs, both physical and spiritual. After such a display of God's power, it's easy to imagine the disciples feeling confident, maybe even a little in awe as they set out across the water. The air was probably filled with quiet conversation and soft laughter, the kind that comes after witnessing something you know you'll never forget. As the boat pushed away from shore, the Sea of Galilee stretched out before them, calm and steady. The shoreline faded, and the sounds of the crowd became distant. For a while, the disciples could relax, letting their hands move with practiced ease on the oars. They were used to these waters. This was their element. It's likely Peter or John shared a word about the miracle, or maybe they sat in silence, each reflecting on what they had seen. Meanwhile, Jesus chose a different path. After sending the disciples ahead and dismissing the crowd, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray, just as Matthew chapter 14, verse 23 describes. This wasn't just about needing space. Jesus' time alone with God was intentional, a moment of preparation, not simply a break from people. He knew what lay ahead, both for himself and for his followers. In solitude, he sought strength and clarity. His prayer was a quiet anchor, a steadying force before the coming storm. This separation between Jesus and the disciples wasn't accidental. While they felt comfortable on the water, Jesus was setting an example, showing the importance of seeking God in prayer, especially before challenges arise. His solitude was not about distance, but about drawing near to God. It's a detail that's easy to overlook, but it shapes the whole story. Jesus' peace on the mountain would soon stand in sharp contrast to the disciples' fear on the water. As the evening wore on, the boat drifted farther from land. The disciples rowed toward Capernaum, a town that was familiar to them, a place where Jesus often taught. The Sea of Galilee, central to their lives and to much of Jesus' ministry, was usually a place of routine and rhythm. Tonight, it felt like any other crossing, predictable and safe. It's in these moments, when life feels steady, that we can forget how quickly things can change. The disciples had no reason to expect trouble. They were doing exactly what Jesus told them to do. Their hearts were still full from witnessing a miracle, their minds at ease with the routine of rowing across the water. Sometimes our own lives feel like this, settled, secure, and moving forward without worry. But the Sea of Galilee is known for its sudden storms. Surrounded by hills, the lake can go from calm to chaos in moments. Even seasoned fishermen knew that danger could come without warning. Still, with years of experience behind them, the disciples might have felt sure they could handle anything the night brought. While Jesus prayed on the mountain, the disciples kept rowing, unaware of what was approaching. The hours slipped by. According to Matthew's account, the storm would strike during the fourth watch of the night, around 3 a.m., when the darkness is thickest and weariness sets in. The disciples were likely exhausted, their muscles aching from hours of rowing, their minds dulled by fatigue. It's easy to relate to this. There are times when we feel like life is under control, when we're following the path we believe God set for us, and everything seems to be going well. We settle into routines, trust our skills, and feel secure in our surroundings. We don't expect the unexpected. Yet, as the disciples were about to discover, storms don't always give advance notice. When the wind began to rise, it probably started as a gentle breeze, nothing unusual for the Sea of Galilee. But then the waves grew taller, the sky darker. The boat that once felt sturdy began to rock, water splashing over the sides. The disciples' conversation faded as they realized they were in trouble. Even with all their experience, the power of nature was overwhelming. In our own lives, it often takes just one moment, a single conversation, a diagnosis, a sudden loss, to turn calm into chaos. One moment we're confident and secure, the next we're struggling to stay afloat. The disciples' fear was real. The storm was not just a test of their sailing skills, but a challenge to their faith and trust. As the storm intensified, the disciples focused on survival. The familiar waters of Galilee no longer felt safe. Every wave threatened to capsize the boat. They were far from shore, far from help, and Jesus was not with them. The comfort of routine and the memory of miracles faded in the face of real danger. It's in these moments that doubts begin to surface. The disciples might have wondered if they had misunderstood Jesus' instructions, or if they had made a mistake by setting out at all. Fear has a way of making us question everything, even our faith. They were alone, or so it seemed, and the storm kept coming. At the same time, Jesus was still on the mountain, praying. He knew what the disciples were facing. His prayer was not disconnected from their struggle. It was a preparation for what he was about to do. The contrast between Jesus' quiet communion with God and the disciples' desperate fight against the storm is striking. It reminds us that God's presence and peace are not always found in the same place as our struggles, but that doesn't mean he is absent. This scene holds a powerful lesson. Sometimes peace comes before the storm, and sometimes the storm reveals how much we need grace. The disciples' journey began with confidence, shaped by the memory of a miracle and the comfort of routine. But when the storm hit, everything changed. Their faith was about to be tested in a way they never expected. As the night wore on and the wind howled, the disciples were left with only their fear and each other. The safety of the familiar was gone. They were tired, afraid, and far from shore, just as the darkest hour of the night approached. The calm that started their journey was a distant memory. So, what do we do when the world shifts beneath us and the things we trusted seem to fail? When the storm is raging and hope feels distant, that's when the story truly begins to unfold. The disciples' fear and struggle set the stage for something they couldn't have imagined. The storm hit without warning, as storms on the Sea of Galilee often do. As the disciples pressed on through the darkness, the sense of control they had enjoyed earlier vanished. Scripture says, "The boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it." Matthew chapter 14, verse 24. That phrase captures more than just rough water. It describes a night when every force seemed to push back against them. The wind howled, the waves crashed, and the boat rocked with every surge. Their muscles ached with the effort of rowing, and the salt spray stung their faces. Fear crept in as their strength faded. Sudden storms on the Sea of Galilee were common. Winds from the surrounding hills could whip the waters into chaos in minutes. But in the thick of the storm, the disciples weren't thinking about geography or weather patterns. They were thinking about survival. The boat that had always been a place of work and routine now felt like a fragile shelter. Each wave that slammed into the hull reminded them just how little control they had left. Just like unanticipated trials in our lives, this storm arrived without warning, testing everything they thought they knew. The disciples, many of them seasoned fishermen, were used to rough water, but this was different. The wind was relentless, the waves overpowering. Their experience and skill could only take them so far. Now, exhaustion and fear began to replace their confidence. As Mark chapter 6, verse 48 puts it, they were distressed in rowing, for the wind was contrary to them, showing the futility of human effort without Jesus. They rowed and rowed, but the boat made little progress. The hours dragged on, and with every passing moment, hope seemed to slip further away. It's not hard to picture their frustration. Every stroke of the oar felt heavier, every gust of wind a reminder that they were not in control. Storms in the Bible often stand for more than just weather. They represent the trials and hardships that come into our lives, sometimes suddenly and without warning. The disciples' struggle on the water is a picture of what it feels like to be overwhelmed, to have every effort blocked by forces you can't control. Maybe you felt that way, when a problem comes out of nowhere and leaves you feeling powerless, or when life pushes back no matter how hard you try. In those moments, it's easy to question where God is. As the disciples fought the wind and waves, they might have wondered if Jesus saw what was happening. Did he know how much they were struggling? Did he care? These are the same questions many of us ask when we find ourselves in the middle of a difficult season. When prayers seem to go unanswered and God feels distant, doubt can creep in. The noise of the storm drowns out what we know is true, and fear takes over. The disciples' boat, a symbol of their comfort and livelihood, had become a place of fear and uncertainty. Every crash of the waves, every gust of wind chipped away at their sense of safety. Their expertise no longer mattered. They were tired, overwhelmed, and too far from shore to steady themselves. The familiar had become unfamiliar, and the safe had become dangerous. As the night wore on, the disciples' struggle grew more desperate. The darkness pressed in, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. With every passing hour, their hope faded. The distance from shore wasn't just physical, it was emotional and spiritual too. They were far from help, far from Jesus, and far from the peace they had felt earlier that evening. It's in these moments, when we're at the end of our strength and don't know what else to do, that our faith is truly tested. The disciples may have wondered if they had misunderstood Jesus' instructions. After all, he was the one who told them to cross the lake. Did he know this would happen? Did he send them into the storm on purpose? These questions lingered, unspoken but heavy, as they fought to keep the boat afloat. But even in the chaos, the story wasn't over. The storm, as fierce as it was, did not have the final say. When life pushes us to our limits, when every effort feels wasted and hope seems lost, that's often when God is working in ways we can't yet see. The disciples couldn't have known what was coming next. From their perspective, the storm was all there was. But Jesus was already aware of their struggle. He had been praying on the mountain, watching over them even when they couldn't see him. The detail in Mark's Gospel, he saw them toiling and rowing, reminds us that God is not distant from our struggles. Even when he seems far away, he sees us. He knows our fears, our doubts, and our cries for help. It's easy to feel alone in the storm. But this story shows that God's attention is never far from those who call out to him. Still, that truth can be hard to hold on to when the storm is raging. The disciples looked out into the darkness and saw nothing but waves and wind, no sign of rescue, no sign of Jesus. Their despair grew as the hours passed. The situation felt hopeless. It's a feeling many of us know, the moment when you want to believe but doubt is louder, when you're trying to hold on but the problem feels too big. This growing sense of despair is something we all face at times. It's the moment when hope feels out of reach and surrender seems like the only option. But surrender, in this story, isn't about giving up. It's about letting go of the idea that we can fix everything on our own. The disciples couldn't row their way back to safety. They had to wait for something, or someone, greater than themselves. The emotions in that boat, fear, doubt, exhaustion, are familiar to anyone who has faced a difficult season. But the message here is clear. Our weakness doesn't keep God away. If anything, it opens the door for grace to enter. The storm revealed just how much the disciples needed Jesus, not just as a teacher or miracle worker, but as the one who could save them when they had nothing left to give. As exhaustion set in and hope seemed to slip away, the disciples were about to witness something they never expected. Jesus did not wait for the storm to end before coming to them. He entered into their fear, their struggle, and their doubt. This moment tells us something important about God's character. He doesn't always remove the storm, but He meets us in the middle of it. His timing is not just perfect, it's purposeful. He comes when we need Him most, not always when we expect Him. When hope seems lost and the storm feels endless, that's often when God's presence breaks through in ways we never imagined. For the disciples, the next moment would change everything. In the darkness and chaos, something, or someone, began to appear on the water. Their fear was about to take on a new shape, and the story was far from over. What would you feel if, in the middle of a storm, you saw someone walking toward you on the water? For the disciples, this moment was anything but calming. A figure began to emerge across the surface of the water, growing clearer with each flash of lightning and every cresting wave. The disciples, already worn thin from hours of rowing and the relentless storm, strained to make sense of what they were seeing. Matthew's Gospel recounts, "When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, 'It is a ghost,' and they cried out for fear." The sight of someone walking on the water, especially in the middle of the night and in the heart of a storm, was something outside anything they had ever imagined. Their fear wasn't just a reaction to the storm or their exhaustion. In first-century Jewish culture, large bodies of water were often seen as places of chaos and mystery, sometimes even associated with evil spirits or the unknown. Stories of ghosts on the water weren't uncommon, and the sea itself symbolized danger and disorder. So when the disciples saw a human-like figure moving toward them on the waves, their minds went to the most frightening explanation they knew. In that moment, fear blurred their vision so profoundly that they couldn't recognize the very person they followed. It's easy to understand why they jumped to this conclusion. Their senses were overwhelmed, and their expectations shaped by the world they lived in. The storm outside matched the turmoil inside. When we're tired and afraid, the mind often fills in the blanks with the worst possibilities. The disciples didn't expect to see Jesus in the storm. They expected trouble. Their cry, "It is a ghost," was shaped by both their fear and their cultural worldview. This moment on the sea isn't just about a physical storm, it's about how fear can distort reality, making it hard to recognize God's presence when we need it most. The disciples had seen Jesus heal the sick, feed thousands, and calm storms before, but in this moment, their panic took over. They couldn't see past their own anxiety. Fear has a way of doing that. It drowns out what we know to be true and replaces it with doubt. But Jesus didn't leave them in that state of confusion. He responded immediately, calling out over the roar of the wind and the crashing of the waves, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." These words cut through the noise and panic. The phrase, "it is I," is especially important. In the original Greek, it echoes the divine name, I am, from the Old Testament, when God spoke to Moses from the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Jesus wasn't just identifying himself as their teacher or friend, he was reminding them of his divine presence and authority, even in the middle of chaos. Imagine hearing those words in the middle of your own storm. The wind hasn't stopped, the waves haven't calmed, but suddenly you hear a voice you recognize, offering reassurance and hope. Jesus didn't wait for the disciples to figure everything out or for their fear to disappear. He met them right where they were, in the thick of their confusion and distress. His words didn't make the storm go away instantly, but they changed the moment. The disciples were still soaked, still tossed by the waves, but now they had a choice. Would they continue to let fear control their perception, or would they trust the one who spoke with such calm authority? Jesus' presence on the water forced them to reconsider what was possible. The storm was still raging, but his words offered a new lens through which to see their situation. This scene reminds us that faith doesn't always mean the absence of fear. Sometimes it means choosing to listen for God's voice, even when everything around us feels uncertain. The disciples' fear didn't disqualify them from experiencing Jesus' presence. In fact, it set the stage for something deeper. Their vulnerability became an opening for grace. Jesus' approach in the storm also tells us something about how God meets us. He doesn't wait for us to be fearless or to have everything figured out. He steps toward us, even when we mistake him for a threat or feel overwhelmed by our circumstances. The disciples' cry of fear was met with reassurance, not rebuke. Jesus saw their distress, understood their confusion, and spoke directly to their need. Mark's Gospel adds that Jesus saw them toiling and rowing before he came to them. He was aware of their struggle, even when they couldn't see him. This detail is easy to overlook, but it's a powerful reminder that God sees us in our hardest moments. We may feel alone or forgotten, but he is always present, moving toward us with compassion and purpose. The timing of Jesus' words is important. He spoke while the storm still raged, not after it had passed. This challenges the idea that God's help only comes when things are calm. In reality, his presence is often most clear when we're at our weakest. The reassurance, "Don't be afraid," is a call to trust, not because the circumstances are safe, but because he is there. For the disciples, this was a turning point. The storm hadn't ended, but something inside them began to shift. They were invited to see Jesus in a new way, not just as a miracle worker or a wise teacher, but as someone with authority over the very forces that threatened them. The familiar boundaries of their faith were being stretched. This story isn't just about the disciples, it speaks to anyone who has felt afraid or uncertain, anyone who has struggled to recognize God's presence in the middle of chaos. Fear can cloud our vision, but Jesus' words cut through that fog. "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." These words invite us to trust even when we don't understand what's happening around us. As you think about this moment, consider how often we let fear shape our understanding of what's possible. The disciples' first reaction was to assume the worst, but Jesus' presence turned their panic into a possibility for faith. He challenged them to see beyond the immediate danger and to trust in something greater. The disciples had a decision to make. Would they stay huddled in fear, or would they respond to Jesus' invitation? His words didn't erase the storm, but they opened the door to a new kind of courage. It's a reminder that faith often begins in the middle of uncertainty, not after it has passed. This scene on the Sea of Galilee is more than just a dramatic story. It's a picture of how God meets us in our storms, sometimes in ways we don't expect, often when we're least prepared. The disciples' fear was real, but so was the presence of the one who came to them on the water. As Jesus' words hung in the air, the disciples faced a moment of choice. Would any of them dare to step onto those waves? The storm still raged, but now there was a path forward, one that required faith, not just in what they could see, but in the voice they heard. What drives someone to step out of safety and into chaos? For Peter, it wasn't recklessness or desperation, it was faith. In the heart of the storm, Peter's voice broke through the noise. This moment, found only in Matthew's Gospel, 14:28-29, stands out for its boldness and its focus on faith. While the other disciples stayed in the boat, Peter made a request that would set him apart, not just in this story but throughout Matthew's account of Jesus' life. "Lord, if it is you," he called, "tell me to come to you on the water." His words echoed across the waves, shaped by a mix of longing and uncertainty. He wanted to be sure that it was truly Jesus, but he also wanted to draw nearer, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Peter's request wasn't an attempt to test Jesus for the sake of spectacle. Instead, it was a way of seeking both assurance and connection. He had heard Jesus' voice say, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Now he wanted to respond, to move toward that voice, even though everything around him screamed danger. Peter's faith was real, but so was his need for confirmation. In that sense, his words are honest and deeply human. They remind us that faith often includes questions, and that it's possible to trust and still ask for a sign. The response from Jesus was simple and direct. "Come." With that single word, the invitation was given. Peter, known for acting first, now steps out of the boat on Jesus' single-word invitation. Their small fishing boat was no place for a miracle, yet Peter asked to leave that fragile safety for something greater. The boat, rocking in the wind and rain, had been their shelter. For Peter, though, staying in the boat meant staying distant from Jesus. The call to come was a call to leave behind what felt secure and step into a place where only trust could hold him up. Imagine the moment Peter swung his legs over the side and placed his feet onto the churning water. The boat behind him, the storm all around, Peter took those first steps toward Jesus. With each step, he experienced the impossible. Water that should have swallowed him now held him up. The wind still whipped across his face, and the waves still surged, but for that brief time, Peter walked where no one else had. He moved forward, not because the conditions had changed, but because Jesus' invitation was greater than his fear. This scene is striking for its simplicity and its depth. Peter's faith wasn't perfect, but it was active. He didn't wait for the storm to pass. He didn't ask for the wind to stop or the sea to calm before stepping out. He simply trusted the one who called him. That trust became action, and that action became a miracle. Sometimes faith looks like moving forward even when you're not sure what will happen next. Peter's willingness to leave the boat is a powerful example for anyone who has ever felt torn between safety and calling. The boat was familiar. It was the place where Peter had spent countless hours working, learning, and surviving. But in this moment, the boat became a symbol of limitation. Peter wasn't content to stay where it was safe if it meant missing the chance to be with Jesus. He chose presence over comfort, relationship over routine. There's a lesson here about the nature of faith. It isn't just about believing certain things or holding the right ideas. Faith, as Peter shows, is about stepping out when you hear God's voice, even if everything else feels uncertain. It's about letting go of what you can control and trusting that Jesus will meet you in the unknown. The storm didn't stop when Peter climbed out of the boat. The danger didn't disappear, but Peter's focus shifted from the chaos around him to the person before him. As Peter walked toward Jesus, every step was loaded with meaning. He was doing something no one else had ever done, and he did it not to prove a point or impress the others, but to be close to Jesus. His boldness wasn't about personal achievement, it was about relationship. He wanted to share in what Jesus was doing, to be where Jesus was, no matter the cost. Matthew's account places Peter at the center of this story, highlighting his role as a representative of the disciples and, by extension, the whole believing community. In taking this step, Peter models what it looks like to respond to Jesus' call. He acts on behalf of all who wrestle with faith and doubt, showing that it's possible to move forward even when you don't have all the answers. As you picture Peter on the water, consider how ordinary he really was. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, he was a fisherman, someone who knew the dangers of the sea better than most. The risk he took wasn't just physical, it was spiritual and emotional as well. He left behind the one thing that gave him a sense of control and stepped into a situation where only Jesus could sustain him. There's a lesson here about the nature of faith. It isn't just about believing certain things or holding the right ideas. Faith, as Peter shows, is about stepping out when you hear God's voice, even if everything else feels uncertain. It's about letting go of what you can control and trusting that Jesus will meet you in the unknown. The storm didn't stop when Peter climbed out of the boat. As Peter walked toward Jesus, every step was loaded with meaning. He was doing something no one else had ever done, and he did it not to prove a point or impress the others, but to be close to Jesus. His boldness wasn't about personal achievement, it was about relationship. He wanted to share in what Jesus was doing, to be where Jesus was no matter the cost. Matthew's account places Peter at the center of this story, highlighting his role as a representative of the disciples and, by extension, the whole believing community. In taking this step, Peter models what it looks like to respond to Jesus' call. He acts on behalf of all who wrestle with faith and doubt, showing that it's possible to move forward even when you don't have all the answers. As you picture Peter on the water, consider how ordinary he really was. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, he was a fisherman, someone who knew the dangers of the sea better than most. The risk he took wasn't just physical, it was spiritual and emotional as well. He left behind the one thing that gave him a sense of control and stepped into a situation where only Jesus could sustain him. With each step, Peter's faith became visible. The water held him up not because of his own strength, but because he responded to Jesus' invitation. This is a reminder that faith isn't about being fearless or never doubting. It's about taking the next step when Jesus says, "Come." Peter didn't analyze the situation or wait for perfect clarity. He moved. And in moving, he experienced something extraordinary. Richard Cassidy points out that Peter's actions in this story show his deep desire to share in Jesus' authority and power. By asking to come to Jesus on the water, Peter wasn't just looking for a miracle. He wanted to participate in what Jesus was doing. He wanted to be drawn into the heart of the action, even if it meant facing the storm head-on. This longing for closeness, for connection, is what sets Peter apart in Matthew's Gospel. It's important to remember that Peter's success wasn't based on his own ability. Without Jesus' invitation, without that word, "come," Peter would have remained in the boat. The miracle depended on both the call and the response. Faith, in this sense, is always relational. It's not just about what we can do, but about what God is inviting us into. For a few moments, Peter walked above the chaos. The wind still howled and the waves still crashed, but his eyes were fixed on Jesus. The storm was real, but it no longer defined his reality. Jesus did. This is the heart of the story. Faith that moves, faith that risks, faith that responds. Peter's bold request and his first steps on the water give us a clear picture of what it means to trust Jesus in the middle of uncertainty. It's not about waiting for everything to make sense or for the storm to pass, but about responding when you hear God's voice. The boat will always feel safer, but the real miracle happens when you're willing to leave it behind. As you reflect on Peter's walk, think about the moments in your own life when you've sensed God calling you to step out. Maybe it's a new challenge, a difficult decision, or a time when you feel stretched beyond your comfort zone. Like Peter, you may feel both faith and uncertainty at the same time. That's normal. What matters is the response. Peter's journey across the water is a reminder that faith is lived out one step at a time. Each movement forward is an act of trust, a way of saying yes to God's invitation. The storm may not quiet right away, and the risks may not disappear, but Jesus' presence makes all the difference. In this story, Peter's boldness shines. He leaves the boat, steps into the storm, and for a brief time walks on water. The impossible becomes possible, not because of who Peter is, but because of who Jesus is. That's the lesson for us as well. When we respond to God's call, we step into a place where His power can sustain us, even when everything else feels uncertain. Yet, even in the midst of this miracle, the story doesn't end with Peter's triumph. There's a turning point coming, a moment when fear tries to take hold again. Peter's steps on the water, remarkable as they are, set the stage for what happens when doubt creeps in and the wind starts to feel overwhelming once more. As we look ahead, Peter's experience invites us to ask, what happens when faith is challenged by fear? How do we respond when the wind and waves threaten to pull us under, even after we've taken that first step? These are questions that matter not just for Peter, but for anyone who is trying to walk by faith in the middle of life's storms. Fear has a way of arriving quietly, even in the middle of a miracle. Peter's first steps on the water were real. He was walking, not sinking, held up by his trust in Jesus' word. But as the wind roared and the waves rose around him, his focus shifted. Matthew's gospel tells us that Peter saw the wind, and as he noticed the force of the storm, his confidence began to slip away. The same storm he'd stepped out into now looked bigger, louder, and more threatening than before. That's how fear often works. It doesn't always come with a sudden crash. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, drawing our attention away from what is steady and true. Peter's story shows this so clearly. He was still moving toward Jesus, but the storm started to fill his vision. The waves that had no power over him a moment ago now seemed to rise up and threaten him. The miracle hadn't stopped. The wind hadn't grown stronger. What changed was Peter's focus. The longer he looked at the storm, the less sure his steps became. We know that moment when our confidence sags and we feel the waves knocking us under. It might be a new challenge, a sudden loss, or a time when life feels overwhelming. What once felt possible now seems out of reach, and the ground beneath us feels less solid. Peter's experience is deeply relatable. He started with faith, but as fear grew, he began to sink. Matthew uses the phrase, beginning to sink, painting a picture of slow, creeping doubt taking over where trust once stood. Peter's sinking wasn't just about the water beneath him, it was about the doubt rising within him. The Gospel of Matthew uses this moment to highlight the idea of little faith. Jesus uses this phrase a few times throughout Matthew's account, including in Matthew chapter 6, verse 30 and chapter 16, verse 8, often as a gentle rebuke. It's not a harsh condemnation, but a reminder that doubt can weaken us and make us vulnerable to fear. For Peter, the storm didn't grow stronger in reality, it simply grew stronger in his mind and heart. That's what fear does. It magnifies what scares us until it feels bigger than the truth we started with. As Peter felt himself sinking, the water climbing higher around his legs, the panic grew. He was no longer walking above the chaos. The miracle seemed to slip away, replaced by the very thing he feared. In that moment, Peter did something simple and honest. He cried out, "Lord, save me." These are the exact words from Matthew chapter 14, verse 30. It wasn't a long or fancy prayer. It was direct. It was urgent. It was the prayer of someone who knew he couldn't save himself. This cry is powerful in its simplicity. Peter didn't try to explain himself or bargain with Jesus. He didn't try to hide his fear or pretend to be strong. He just called out for help. That's often what our own prayers sound like when we're overwhelmed. Short, desperate, and honest. And that's enough. Peter's call, "Lord, save me," is a prayer that many of us have whispered or shouted in our hardest moments. Matthew's telling of this story is careful and intentional. By including Peter's sinking, Matthew shows both the limits of human faith and the compassion of Jesus. Fear is part of the human experience. Even those closest to Jesus had moments when doubt crept in. But what matters in this story isn't just that Peter doubted. It's what he did when he felt himself going under. Peter's cry for help was not a failure of faith. It was an act of faith. He turned to Jesus, trusting that even though he was afraid, Jesus would not let him go. This is an important lesson for anyone who feels like doubt disqualifies them from God's help. Faith isn't about never wavering. It's about knowing where to turn when you do. The phrase Jesus uses, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" comes after he reaches out to Peter. In Matthew's Gospel, little faith is a recurring theme. We see it in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus tells the crowd not to worry about their needs, Matthew 6:30, and again when the disciples misunderstand his teaching, Matthew 16:8. Each time, it's a gentle correction, not a harsh judgment. It's as if Jesus is saying, "You know me, you've seen what I can do. Why let fear take over now?" Fear in Peter's story is not just an emotion, it's a shift in focus. The storm outside didn't change, but Peter's attention moved away from Jesus and toward the danger. That's what makes faith feel so fragile sometimes. The circumstances are real, but faith asks us to keep our eyes on something deeper, something more lasting than the wind and the waves. Think about a time when you felt yourself sinking, when the challenge before you seemed bigger than your ability to handle it. Maybe you started with hope, but as the reality set in, fear and doubt began to grow. Peter's story gives us permission to admit those moments. It shows us that even when we falter, Jesus is still close enough to hear our cry. Peter's sinking is not the end of his story. It's a turning point. The act of calling out, "Lord, save me," is itself a declaration of trust. He knew he couldn't stand on the water by his own strength. He knew he needed someone greater. That's what makes this story so encouraging. Jesus doesn't wait for Peter to figure everything out. He doesn't stand back and wait for perfect faith. He responds to the honest plea for help. This moment also challenges how we think about doubt. It's easy to see doubt as the opposite of faith. But in Matthew's Gospel, doubt is more about distraction, letting something else take the place of trust. Peter wasn't turning away from Jesus, he was just overwhelmed by what was happening around him. That's a very human experience. We all have times when the noise of life drowns out what we know is true. Jesus' response to Peter's cry is immediate. He doesn't hesitate or lecture first. He reaches out and catches Peter. The words, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" are spoken after the rescue, not before. That order matters. Jesus' compassion comes first, then the gentle challenge. It's a reminder that God's grace isn't held back by our weakness. He meets us in our need, and then invites us to trust Him more deeply. There's comfort in knowing that Jesus responds to our cries, even when they come from a place of fear. He doesn't require us to have perfect faith before He acts. Instead, He meets us in the middle of our struggles. Peter's story shows that the journey of faith includes moments of sinking as well as walking. Both are part of what it means to follow Jesus. As the wind howls and the waves crash, Peter's desperate call stands out. It's a moment of honesty, a moment when pride falls away and need is all that remains. This is where grace enters the story. Peter's failure is not final. His doubt does not disqualify him. Instead, it becomes the very place where Jesus' compassion is revealed. The question, "Why did you doubt?" is not meant to shame Peter, but to draw him back to the truth of who Jesus is. It's a question that invites reflection, not regret. Jesus is inviting Peter, and all of us, to remember what we have seen, to recall the times when faith carried us, and to trust that He will do it again. This story is often read as a lesson about faith, but it's just as much a lesson about grace. Peter's sinking is not a defeat, it's an encounter with the saving presence of Jesus. The water that threatened to swallow him becomes the place where he is rescued. The fear that made him falter is met by the hand that lifts him up. If you find yourself in a season where fear feels stronger than faith, let Peter's story remind you that you're not alone. The journey of faith is not a straight line. It's full of ups and downs, moments of courage, and moments of doubt. What matters is that you know who to call out to when you begin to sink. Jesus' words, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" are not the end of the story. They are a doorway to deeper trust. They invite us to look beyond our circumstances and remember the one who calls us out onto the water in the first place. As Peter's hand reaches out and his voice echoes across the storm, the next moment will show us even more about Jesus' heart. How does he respond when fear has left us gasping for help? What does his touch mean for those who are struggling to stay afloat? These are the questions that lead us forward as the story moves from sinking to rescue and from fear to grace. Peter's hand reached up through the water, his voice raw with urgency. "Lord, save me!" In that instant, Jesus acted. The Gospel of Matthew uses the word immediately, the Greek term euthys, to show just how quickly Jesus responded. There was no pause, no hesitation. Before Peter could slip beneath the surface, Jesus reached out and caught him. The hand that saves is never slow to move when we call out in faith, no matter how small that faith feels. This moment reveals something important about Jesus' character. When Peter cried out, Jesus didn't stand back and wait. He didn't demand that Peter prove himself or figure things out alone. He simply reached for Peter and held him up. The storm was still raging, but Jesus' presence changed everything for Peter. The rescue came first. Correction or teaching would come later, but grace led the way. It's easy to imagine the scene, the cold water rising, Peter gasping, and then the steady grip of Jesus' hand. The wind howled, the waves tossed the boat, but Jesus was unwavering. He met Peter right where he was, half sunk, afraid, and overwhelmed. Jesus' first act was compassion, not criticism. The word immediately isn't just a detail, it's a promise. When you call out, Jesus is already moving toward you. Think about what this means for us. How many times do we feel like we have to get it all together before asking God for help? Or we worry that our doubts and fears make us unworthy of rescue. But Peter's story shows that grace doesn't wait for us to be strong. It meets us in weakness. The moment Peter reached for help, Jesus reached back. The storm didn't need to end before Jesus acted. Your struggles don't need to disappear before God responds. Jesus' response wasn't just about pulling Peter out of danger, it was also about restoring his faith. After catching him, Jesus said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" It's important to notice the order. First the rescue, then the question. Grace comes before correction. Jesus' words weren't a harsh rebuke. They were gentle, spoken with care for Peter's growth. The phrase, "you of little faith," appears several times in Matthew's Gospel. Each time it's a way of inviting reflection, not shaming the person who's struggling. Imagine Peter, soaked and shivering, still held by Jesus as the storm raged around them. The question, "Why did you doubt?" wasn't meant to embarrass him. It was meant to help him see how fear had shifted his focus. Jesus wanted Peter to realize that faith is possible even in the middle of chaos. He didn't say, "You have no faith." He said, "Your faith was little." That's a big difference. It means there was faith present, just not enough to silence every doubt. What might Jesus be saying to you when he asks, "Why did you doubt?" Maybe it's a reminder that you can trust him even when things look impossible. Maybe it's an invitation to look back at the times when he's come through for you before. Or maybe it's simply a gentle call to keep your eyes on him rather than the storms around you. Jesus isn't looking for perfection, he's looking for honesty, a willingness to reach out even if your faith feels small. This story shows that grace meets us at our weakest, not our strongest. Peter's faith got him out of the boat, but it was Jesus' grace that pulled him out of the water when he faltered. That's the heart of the gospel. We step out in faith, but we're held up by grace. If you've ever felt like you failed because you doubted or struggled, remember Peter. His story didn't end with sinking. It continued with rescue and with Jesus' hand steadying him above the waves. Let's pause and reflect on the power of that moment. Peter's cry wasn't eloquent or planned. It was raw, simple, and honest. And it was enough. Sometimes the most powerful prayers are the shortest and most desperate. "Lord, save me" is a prayer that Jesus always hears. You don't need to have the right words or a perfect heart. You just need to call out. Jesus' words to Peter, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" invite us to consider our own hearts. Where do we let fear drown out faith? When do we lose sight of Jesus in the middle of life's storms? Wondering we have fear that I adopted self the air, these questions aren't meant to shame us. They're meant to help us grow. Every time Jesus used the phrase, "you of little faith," in Matthew, it was to teach, not to condemn. It was a way of saying, remember who I am, remember what you've seen me do. There's comfort in knowing that Jesus doesn't turn away when we struggle. He doesn't wait for us to have perfect faith before he acts. Peter's experience shows that even when we falter, Jesus is close enough to catch us. The hand that reaches for us is steady, strong, and sure. Our doubts don't disqualify us. In fact, they become the very place where grace enters. Think about how this plays out in your own life. Maybe you've stepped out in faith only to find yourself overwhelmed by circumstances. Maybe you've started strong, but fear crept in and made you question everything. Peter's story is for you. It's for anyone who's ever tried and failed, believed and doubted, walked and then sunk. The message is simple. Jesus still reaches. He doesn't withdraw when we struggle. He draws near. The way Jesus responds to Peter also teaches us about the nature of correction. He doesn't shame Peter in front of the others or use the moment to make an example out of him. Instead, he speaks quietly after the rescue, when Peter is safe. Grace comes first, then growth. Jesus wants us to learn from our moments of weakness, but he always meets us with compassion first. This balance between faith and grace is central to the story. Peter's faith was real, but it wasn't enough to keep him above the waves. That's true for all of us. Our faith will have limits. There will be times when we falter, but grace is always greater. It's not a backup plan for when we fail, it's the foundation that holds us up, even when our faith is small. Picture Jesus and Peter standing together on the water, the storm still swirling. The danger hasn't disappeared, but the focus has shifted. Peter is no longer sinking, he's being held. The storm is real, but Jesus' presence is more powerful. That's the promise for all who follow him. You may not be able to control the wind and waves, but you can trust the one who does. If you're in a season where doubt feels stronger than faith, let this story encourage you. You're not alone in your struggle. The journey of faith isn't about never doubting, it's about knowing where to turn when you do. Peter's cry, "Lord, save me," is a model for all of us. It's a reminder that Jesus is always ready to respond, immediately, with compassion and strength. As the scene between Peter and Jesus unfolds, the storm still rages, but something has changed. Peter is safe, not because the water is calm, but because Jesus holds him. The hand that reaches is a hand that saves, teaches, and restores. No matter how many times you falter, that hand is always there. Now, imagine what happens as they move together toward the boat. The wind hasn't died down yet, and the waves are still rolling. But the most important thing has already happened. Peter has been rescued, and his faith has been met with grace. The story is about to shift again, and the next moment will bring a new kind of peace, one that comes not from the absence of trouble, but from the presence of Jesus. As Jesus and Peter approach the boat, the storm is still raging. The disciples watch, hearts pounding, waiting to see what will happen next. The moment Jesus and Peter reached the boat, everything changed. The chaos of the storm had filled the night, but now something remarkable happened. Matthew chapter 14, verse 32 says, "And when they climbed into the boat, the wind ceased." It wasn't a gradual settling. The wind didn't fade bit by bit. The moment Jesus entered the boat, the storm ended. The water stilled, the air calmed, and the noise that had surrounded them dropped away in an instant. The sudden quiet must have felt almost unreal after hours of battling the wind and waves. Picture the disciples, soaked and exhausted, sitting in the boat as the silence settled around them. For a long time, all they had known was the roar of the wind and the slap of waves against the hull. Now, in a single moment, it was over. Their hearts were still racing, their hands still gripping the sides of the boat, but the world around them had shifted. The fear that had filled them gave way to something new, a sense of awe, a realization that they were in the presence of someone who could command even the forces of nature. This wasn't just a story about the weather. The calm after the chaos was more than relief from danger. It was a sign. Jesus didn't calm the storm until he was with them in the boat. He didn't stand far off and shout instructions or wait for the disciples to figure things out on their own. He came close, reached out, and then brought peace. The timing makes all the difference. Jesus' presence changed the environment completely. The peace he brings isn't just about quieting the world outside, it's about transforming the hearts of those who are with him. There's a deep meaning in the stillness that followed. In the Bible, storms often represent trouble, confusion, and fear. When the storm stopped, it was a clear sign of Jesus' authority. Just as God once stilled the Red Sea, Jesus' presence brought instant peace here. The disciples had seen miracles before, but this was different. The storm had threatened their lives, and now, in a heartbeat, it was gone. The calm was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was a reminder that Jesus holds power over everything that scares us, everything that feels out of control. Their reaction was immediate and honest. Matthew tells us, "Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" Matthew 14:33. They didn't just breathe a sigh of relief or talk about what had happened. They worshipped. In that moment, everything they had seen and heard came together. The miracles, the teachings, the compassion. Now it was clear. Jesus was more than a teacher, more than a prophet. He was the Son of God. This declaration was a turning point. Up to now, the disciples had followed Jesus, learned from him, and witnessed his power. But this was the first time they put it into words so clearly. Their worship wasn't just about gratitude for surviving the storm. It was about recognizing who Jesus truly was. The calm after the chaos gave them a new understanding, a deeper faith. They saw that Jesus' authority wasn't limited to healing the sick or feeding crowds. He could command the wind and the waves. He could bring peace where there had been none. We've all felt the relief when life's storms suddenly calm, only to realize God has been at work all along. Sometimes we don't notice his presence until the chaos subsides. Other times we only recognize the depth of his care when we look back and see how he brought us through. The disciples experienced this firsthand. Their fear and struggle weren't wasted. They led to a moment of worship, a moment when faith became real in a new way. The calm after the storm is also a reminder that peace doesn't always come in the way we expect. The disciples might have hoped for the storm to stop before Jesus reached them, or for the wind to die down as soon as they called out for help. But Jesus waited until he was with them in the boat. His timing was perfect, even if it didn't match their expectations. The peace he brought was complete, leaving no doubt about his power or his care. In that boat, the disciples were changed. The storm had shown them their limits, but it also showed them Jesus' limitless power. They had tried everything they knew to survive, but it was His presence that made the difference. Their worship was a response to this discovery. It was simple and sincere. Truly, you are the Son of God. They didn't need fancy words or explanations. The experience spoke for itself. In that boat, the disciples were changed. The storm had shown them their limits, but it also showed them Jesus' limitless power. They had tried everything they knew to survive, but it was His presence that made the difference. Their worship was a response to this discovery. It was simple and sincere. Truly, you are the Son of God. They didn't need fancy words or explanations. The experience spoke for itself. This story invites us to reflect on our own lives. How often do we look for peace in the wrong places? How often do we try to fix things on our own, only to realize we need Jesus to step in? The calm that follows our storms is a gift, a chance to see the truth more clearly. It's a reminder that God's power is not limited by our circumstances. He can bring peace at any moment, in any situation. The disciples' worship is an example for us. When God brings us through a difficult season, our first response should be gratitude and reverence. It's easy to move on quickly, to forget the struggle once the peace comes, but the disciples paused. They let the moment sink in. Their hearts turned to worship, to acknowledging Jesus for who He is. Let's take a moment to reflect on what this means for us. When storms come, it's natural to be afraid. It's natural to wonder if God is with us or if He hears our prayers. But this story shows that Jesus is never far away. He comes to us in the middle of the chaos, reaches out His hand, and brings peace. The calm after the chaos is not just an end to trouble, it's a beginning. It's a chance to know Jesus more deeply, to trust Him more fully, and to worship Him with our whole hearts. The story of the storm on the Sea of Galilee is more than just an account of danger and rescue. It's a picture of the journey from fear to faith, from chaos to calm, from doubt to worship. The disciples' experience teaches us that Jesus' presence changes everything. He doesn't promise a life without storms, but He does promise to be with us in every storm. And when the time is right, He brings peace that goes beyond understanding. As you think about the calm after the chaos, consider how Jesus has brought peace into your own life. Maybe it was after a time of uncertainty, a season of loss, or a period of anxiety. Maybe you didn't recognize His presence at first, but looking back, you can see how He was working all along. The disciples' story encourages us to look for those moments and to respond with worship and gratitude. Their worship in the boat was not the end of their journey, it was a new beginning. They would face other storms, other challenges, and other moments of doubt. But the memory of this night, the night when Jesus calmed the storm and revealed Himself as the Son of God, would stay with them. It would shape their faith and their understanding of who Jesus was. Let's remember that the calm after the chaos is more than just relief. It's an invitation to deeper faith, to seeing Jesus in a new light, and to worshiping Him for who He truly is. The disciples' journey shows us that faith grows not just in moments of triumph, but in moments of struggle and surrender. The peace Jesus brings is lasting, and it changes us from the inside out. As we move forward, let's keep this story close to our hearts. Let it remind us that no matter how fierce the storm, Jesus' presence brings peace. When the chaos ends, let's be people who pause, reflect, and worship. Let's allow the calm to deepen our trust and shape our response to God. There's much to learn from what happened on the water that night. The disciples' experience of fear, faith, rescue, and worship offers a model for our own lives. Their journey didn't end with the storm. It continued as they grew in understanding and trust. This story invites us to consider our own journey of faith, to think about how we respond when Jesus brings peace into our chaos. and to reflect on the impact that can have on our daily lives. After Peter is safe, Jesus says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This isn't condemnation, but a nudge to refocus on Him, not the storm. Jesus' words are gentle, meant to teach, not to shame. He points out that faith is not about having no fear, but about keeping your eyes on Him even when fear is real. Peter's little faith was enough to get him out of the boat and to call for help. That's what matters. Faith doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be real. This story reminds us that we aren't called to perfect faith, just to trust enough to call on Him when we're overwhelmed. Peter's faith wasn't flawless, but it was enough. He stepped out, faltered, and still, Jesus was there. The lesson isn't to never doubt, but to know who to call when you do. Even when faith feels small, grace is always bigger. So, when we feel ourselves sinking, Peter's story invites us to call out, "Lord, save me," because grace always meets us. We don't have to wait until we have it all together. Jesus doesn't ask us to be fearless or never question. He asks us to trust Him enough to reach out, especially when we're struggling. The pattern is clear. Faith leads us to step out. Fear will sometimes follow, but grace is always ready to catch us. Think about your own life. Where have you felt called to step out in faith? Maybe it's a new job, a relationship, a move, or a decision that feels risky. At first, you might feel brave, certain that you're doing what God wants. But then, challenges come, the wind picks up, and doubts start to swirl. You wonder if you made the right choice, if you heard God clearly, or if you're in over your head. That's when Peter's story becomes your story. The moment you feel yourself sinking, you can call out to Jesus, and He'll be there. That's what grace looks like in everyday life. This isn't just a story for people with big, dramatic struggles. It's for anyone who's ever felt overwhelmed, uncertain, or afraid. Maybe your storm is quiet and hidden, anxiety, loneliness, or worries about the future. Maybe it's loud and obvious, a crisis, a loss, or a change you didn't expect. Whatever your storm looks like, the lesson is the same. Faith isn't about pretending the storm isn't real. It's about knowing who to call when you're in it. Peter's experience on the water stands as one of the clearest pictures of faith and grace woven together. His story isn't just about a dramatic miracle. It's about what happens in the space between believing and sinking, and how Jesus responds when we're caught in that space. Peter's journey shows 3 steps. He steps out in faith, fear floods in, and grace rescues him. This pattern is as real for us today as it was for Peter on the Sea of Galilee. Let's look closely at how this pattern unfolds. Peter begins with a bold request. He sees Jesus and calls out, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." It's not a reckless dare, but a real act of trust. Peter knows Jesus well enough to believe that if Jesus calls, the impossible becomes possible. For a few steps, that trust holds. Peter walks on water, doing what no one else in the boat dared to do. In that moment, faith is not just an idea, it's action. Peter steps away from what's safe and moves toward Jesus, even though everything around him is uncertain. But then, the wind and the waves grab Peter's attention. He notices the storm more than the Savior. Fear creeps in, and his confidence begins to slip away. The same water that held him up now seems ready to swallow him. Peter's faith doesn't disappear, but it falters. He starts to sink, not all at once, but gradually, as doubt takes up more space in his heart than trust. This is the moment many of us know well. We start out strong, but when life gets hard, fear and doubt make us question if we can keep going. Jesus' response to Peter is key. Scripture tells us that as Peter begins to sink, he cries out, "Lord, save me." There's no hesitation, no attempt to fix things on his own. Peter doesn't turn to the other disciples or try to swim back to the boat. He calls out to Jesus, simple, direct, and honest. And Jesus responds immediately. The Gospel uses the word immediately to show just how fast Jesus acts. He reaches out, grabs Peter, and pulls him up. Grace comes before anything else. Jesus doesn't let Peter go under. He doesn't wait for Peter to figure it out or muster up more faith. The rescue comes first. Peter's example is encouraging because it's so human. He's not perfect. He's bold, but he's also vulnerable. He trusts, but he also doubts. And through it all, Jesus doesn't give up on him. That's the heart of grace. Jesus meets us where we are, not where we wish we were. He comes close, reaches out, and lifts us up. The rescue doesn't depend on having everything figured out. It depends on calling out for help. The disciples' response after the storm is just as important. When Jesus and Peter climb back into the boat and the wind dies down, the disciples worship him. They say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Their worship is a response to what they have seen and experienced. It's not just relief that the storm is over, it's awe at who Jesus is and what he's done. This is the natural result of faith and grace working together. When we see God move in our lives, our hearts turn to worship. We recognize that he's more than a helper. He's the one who commands the storm and brings peace. This moment in the boat marks a turning point for the disciples. They've seen miracles before, but this one feels different. It's personal. They saw Peter step out, falter, and be rescued. They saw Jesus' power not just to heal or provide, but to save in the middle of chaos. Their worship is simple and sincere. It comes from a place of deep gratitude and new understanding. That's what happens when grace meets us in our weakness. We see Jesus more clearly, and our faith grows deeper. The story of Peter walking on water is more than a lesson about risk or bravery. It's a model of what it means to live by faith and to depend on grace. We will have moments when we step out and feel strong and moments when we stumble and need to be rescued. Both are part of the journey. What matters is not whether we never doubt, but whether we know where to turn when we do. Jesus is always near, always ready to reach out, always offering grace. Let's take a moment to reflect on what this means for us. We don't have to be perfect to experience God's love and help. We don't have to hide our fears or pretend we never struggle. Faith is about taking the next step, trusting that Jesus will meet us, and knowing that grace is waiting even when we fall short. When we worship, we acknowledge that it's not our strength that saves us, but God's presence and power. This story invites us to be honest about our doubts and our fears. It reminds us that Jesus doesn't turn away from our weakness. In fact, it's often in those moments that he comes closest. Peter's cry, "Lord, save me," is a prayer we can all pray. It's simple, but it's enough. And every time we pray it, we can trust that Jesus hears and responds. So as you face your own storms, big or small, remember Peter's journey. Let it remind you that faith is not about never sinking, but about knowing who to call when you do. And when grace meets you in your weakness, let your response be worship, just like the disciples in the boat. Their words, "Truly, you are the Son of God," are a declaration that Jesus is worthy of our trust, our praise, and our hope. When we look at this story, we see a Savior who is always present, always watching, and always ready to reach out. Our faith may be small, but his grace is more than enough. That's the model Peter gives us, a faith that steps out, a heart that calls for help, and a life that responds in worship. If you ever wonder how to move forward when you're afraid or unsure, remember that even a little faith can lead to rescue. Jesus doesn't ask for perfection, he asks for trust. And every time we call out to him, he is there, immediately, with grace and strength. That is the hope we carry, no matter how strong the storm. As you consider what this means for your own journey, let Peter's story encourage you to keep stepping out, keep trusting, and keep calling on Jesus. Faith and grace go hand in hand, and together they lead us closer to the one who calms every storm. And as we close, let's hold on to this simple truth. Faith isn't about having it all together. It's about knowing where to turn when everything falls apart.